It was the first weekend of summer break when I was 17. The weather was perfect, and I was hanging out with my best friend, Kate. She lived in a house just a couple of blocks away from mine, and on this particular night, her parents were out of town. I wasn't expecting anything strange to happen, just a chill evening with friends. But sometimes, the most normal nights can take a terrifying turn. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when I arrived at Kate's house. The front yard was already filled with friends, Lily, Rachel, and a few other people from school. We hung out in her backyard, played music, and talked about everything and nothing. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Around midnight, everyone started leaving. Most people lived nearby, but since Kate's parents weren't around, she was staying up late. I stayed behind to help clean up the mess. The last person to leave was Andrew, a guy from our school who had a crush on Kate, but she didn't feel the same way. I wasn't a fan of him either, but I didn't say anything. He tried to stick around and chat, but I didn't have the energy for it. I told him I was leaving and started walking home. It wasn't a long walk, about 15 minutes, but it was a walk I made almost every night without thinking twice. The streets were calm, the suburban neighborhood peaceful as usual. I shoved my hands into the pockets of my hoodie and started strolling down the familiar road. 5 minutes into my walk, I noticed something strange. I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just another person out for a late-night walk, but the footsteps kept getting closer. I quickened my pace, hoping I was just imagining it. But then, they got faster too. When I looked back, I saw a man, about my dad's age, in a dark hoodie. His face was hidden, and he walked with his hands in his pockets, just like I was. I tried to ignore him, but the closer he got, the more uncomfortable I felt. There was something about the way he moved. Too deliberate, too controlled. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to panic, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. I kept walking, trying to act normal. But after a few more minutes, I realized he was still behind me, and he wasn't getting any further away. "Nice night, isn't it?" the man called from behind me. I froze. That was too strange. I turned my head slowly to glance at him. He was about 10 feet behind me now, still walking at the same pace. His voice was casual, but something about it made my stomach churn. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to sound normal, though my voice cracked a little. I turned my gaze forward again, my steps quickening as I tried to act calm. I looked around for a safe place, but the street was eerily empty. No houses were nearby, and the streetlights were spaced too far apart. "Do you live around here?" the man asked, his voice almost too friendly. I didn't answer him. I just kept walking faster, now at a brisk pace. But it was like he was matching my steps exactly. Every time I turned a corner, he followed. There was no way he could have been heading the same way as me. It had to be intentional. I was starting to panic. Why was he following me? "Are you from around here?" he asked again. I wasn't sure what to say, but I kept my response short, barely above a whisper. "Yes." Then he said something that made my heart drop. "I know where you live." My breath caught in my throat. I froze. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I glanced over my shoulder to see him smiling in the shadows, the creepy smile now fully visible. His hands were still tucked in his pockets, but I could see the outline of something. Something that looked like a knife. My stomach sank. Fear coursed through me, and my mind raced. My house wasn't far, but I couldn't let him know that. I quickly texted Kate, "Call me. Something's wrong. Someone's following me." But my phone only buzzed with the incoming message, "No service." I felt trapped. I wasn't close enough to any houses for anyone to hear me, and I couldn't outrun him. Panic settled into my bones. I started walking faster, trying not to show any fear. I knew I had to make it to my house, to safety. But then, as if sensing my anxiety, the man started walking faster too. "Hey, don't be scared. I won't hurt you." His voice was a sickening mix of calm and creepy. Without thinking, I broke into a full sprint. I could hear him behind me now, his footsteps matching my own, faster and faster. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted down a few more blocks, knowing my house wasn't far. I kept pushing myself harder, knowing that if I didn't make it to safety, it could be over. Suddenly, I reached my front yard. The lights were on, and I could see my parents' car parked in the driveway. I ran to the door, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it quickly. The man stopped in the middle of the street and watched me from a distance. For a moment, I thought I saw him smile again, but it was just a blur as I stumbled inside and locked all the windows. I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath. The terror that had gripped me seemed to dissolve into a fog of confusion. What had just happened? Was he really just some random creep? Or did he know something about me? My parents weren't home yet, but I was too terrified to be alone. I called Kate, who immediately started to get worried. She wanted to come over, but I told her not to. I felt safer just staying inside. Then, as if fate had a cruel sense of humor, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. There was no way. I peered through the peephole. It was a police officer. I opened the door, and the officer explained that there had been reports of a suspicious person in the area. He asked if I had seen anyone or felt unsafe. I recounted everything, every detail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. The officers said they would patrol the area for the rest of the night. I felt a little safer with them around, but my mind kept racing. Who was that man? What did he want from me? Weeks passed, and nothing else happened. I never saw that man again. But every time I walked home, I felt his presence, like a shadow following me, even though I knew it couldn't be him. I'll never know who that man was or what his intentions were. But that night changed me. It taught me that danger doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it's just a smile in the dark. It was supposed to be a simple stop, just one night at an old friend's house. I was driving back from a business trip in Colorado to my home in Texas. It was a long haul, and I didn't want to risk falling asleep at the wheel. That's when I remembered my old high school buddy, Eric, lived along my route. We hadn't spoken in a couple of years, but when I texted him, he responded immediately, saying I was more than welcome to crash at his place. I arrived around 9 p.m. His house sat on the outskirts of a small town, miles away from the nearest highway. The road leading up to it was gravel, lined with thick, dark trees. It wasn't run down, but it had that old, lived-in feel. The kind of place that had seen decades pass, without changing much. Eric greeted me warmly, and we spent hours catching up, drinking a few beers, and reminiscing about our reckless teenage years. By the time we called it a night, it was past midnight. He led me to a guest room at the end of a narrow hallway. "It's not much, but it's clean," he said. The room was small, with antique wooden furniture and a bed that looked like it had been there for decades. The air smelled faintly of dust and old books. The only odd thing was the closet. It had no door, just an empty, gaping darkness. A single, dim lamp on the nightstand cast long shadows across the floor. "I'll be in the next room if you need anything," Eric said before heading to bed. I was exhausted, but as I lay in bed, a strange unease crept over me. Maybe it was the isolation of the house, or the unfamiliar sounds of the woods outside, but something felt off. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head toward the doorway, but it was empty. The hallway was dark. I swallowed hard and shook it off. Old houses creak. It's normal. But then I heard it again. This time, it was inside the room. I bolted upright, heart pounding. My eyes darted around, but nothing had changed. The closet, the furniture, the dim light, it was all the same. But the feeling in the air had shifted. The room felt heavier, like something unseen had entered. I stared at the open closet, my breath shallow. Had it always been that dark? The shadows inside seemed deeper now, stretching into nothingness. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but just as I turned the screen on, a whisper. Low, almost inaudible. I froze. My ears strained, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind outside, or my mind playing tricks on me after a long drive. Then, from the closet, a faint rustling, like fabric shifting. My fingers gripped the sheets. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of that room. But I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing. Then, the whisper came again. This time, I understood it. A single word, stretched out in a slow, breathy murmur. Sleep. My body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed my phone and flipped on the flashlight, aiming it directly at the closet. Nothing. Just empty space. The whispering stopped. The rustling ceased. But the heaviness in the air remained, wrapping around me like invisible hands. I couldn't stay in that room. I bolted for the hallway and knocked on Eric's door. He opened it, groggy and confused. Something's in that room, I stammered, my voice shaking. I heard something in the closet. Eric frowned but followed me back to the guest room. We both stood in the doorway, looking inside. The room was still. You probably just dreamed it, he said. But then he hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the closet, his brows furrowing slightly. You know what's weird? He muttered. I don't think I've ever looked inside that closet before. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Before I could say anything, Eric stepped forward and flicked on the overhead light. Then, slowly, he approached the closet. With a deep breath, he reached in. A pause. Then his hand brushed against something soft. His face went pale. He yanked his hand back like he'd touched fire. There's something in there, he whispered. I grabbed my phone and aimed the flashlight into the darkness. Hanging inside was a long, tattered coat. Dark, heavy, and swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. And beneath it, 2 bare feet. We didn't scream. We didn't speak. We just ran. Eric grabbed his car keys and we left the house without looking back. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station miles away. Only then did we dare to breathe. Neither of us wanted to go back. We called the cops, claiming we thought there had been an intruder, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. The closet was empty. The coat was gone. I never went back to Eric's house. He moved out a few months later, said the place never felt right after that night. He told me once that sometimes he still hears whispers when he's alone. I try not to think about it, but sometimes, late at night, when my room is dark and silent, I swear I hear it too. A whisper, soft, almost inaudible, telling me to sleep. A few years ago, when I was 19, I went on a road trip with my cousin Daniel. It was summer, and we had planned a cross-country drive, camping along the way to save money. We both loved the outdoors, and the idea of sleeping under the stars in remote locations felt like an adventure. One night, after a long drive through unfamiliar back roads, we realized we needed to find a place to sleep. The nearest campground was miles away, and we were exhausted. Daniel, always the risk-taker, suggested we just find a clearing in the woods and set up camp. I hesitated but agreed. We pulled off a small dirt road, found a spot surrounded by dense trees, and set up our tent. As we unpacked, I noticed something strange. Farther down the road, there was an old truck parked near the tree line. It looked abandoned, its windows dark, and no one was around. It made me uneasy, but Daniel brushed it off. "Probably some hunter's truck," he said. After setting up the tent, we built a small fire and ate some sandwiches. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet. There were no usual night sounds, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We zipped ourselves into the tent, and Daniel fell asleep almost instantly. I lay there, listening. The silence outside felt heavy, like something was pressing against my ears. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the dry leaves outside our tent. They weren't coming from the direction of our car, but from the woods behind us. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, listening. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I wanted to wake Daniel, but I was too scared to move. Then, something brushed against the fabric of the tent. Slow and deliberate, like someone running a hand along it. My body tensed. I held my breath, waiting. A few moments passed in silence. Then, the footsteps moved again, circling the tent. My heart was pounding. I forced myself to turn my head toward Daniel, but just as I reached out to shake him awake, we heard it. A long, drawn-out whistle. It came from the direction of the truck. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It sounded human. Daniel shot up, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I barely had time to nod before another whistle echoed, this time closer. Then came the worst part. A response. Another whistle, from the trees behind us. Whoever was out there wasn't alone. Daniel and I locked eyes, both frozen in place. He mouthed, "What do we do?" I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The moment the beam hit the tent walls, the footsteps ran, fast, toward the trees. We unzipped the tent in a frenzy, grabbed our keys, and sprinted for the car. As Daniel fumbled to unlock the doors, I dared to look back toward the truck. A figure stood next to it, tall, unmoving, watching. As soon as the doors unlocked, we jumped in and floored it down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, the figure still stood there, staring as we sped away. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station miles away. Both of us sat there, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, Daniel suggested we go back in daylight, just to prove to ourselves that it wasn't anything sinister. I refused. I didn't want to see whatever we had almost encountered. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through local news when I saw something that made my stomach drop. A missing persons report. A man had disappeared near that same forest. His abandoned truck had been found parked near the tree line, untouched. Just like the one we saw. I don't know who or what was watching us that night. But I do know one thing. We weren't supposed to be there.